All right, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. This is Galen Barbos at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Thanks for joining us. The webinar today is the first in a series of webinars that we'll be giving on work that addresses demand charges for solar customers. This is a series of projects that we'll be implementing over the course of this year. It's a collaborative effort between the set of researchers listed here on this slide from both Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I'm going to hand things over in a second to my colleague Naeem Dargouth, who will really walk us through the material. Before doing that, though, I just want to go over the standard housekeeping items. So first, the slides that you see here and a recording of the webinar will be posted online within a day or two after the webinar. There also is a longer slide deck that is already available online, and we'll be giving you the URL where you can find that. In terms of the webinar itself, so you all are in listen-only mode. We are going to have some time for Q&A at the end, though, and so I just ask folks to enter any questions that you may have into the chat window. And feel free to do it as we go along. I'll be kind of working in the background, compiling questions and queuing them up for the Q&A session at the end. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Naeem.
Great. Thanks, Galen, and thank you all for joining us today. I hope you find this webinar useful and interesting. And as Galen said, please do feel free to enter questions in the chat box. As Galen said also, these slides are available on the website in a more detailed form, as is an executive summary of the study, more in kind of text, full prose form. Before I get started, I wanted to thank the Department of Energy's Solar Energy Technologies Office in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, and I also wanted to thank the member of our advisory group and the reviewers of earlier versions of this slide deck. So let's jump in. We have a lot to cover in the next 40 minutes or so. I'm not going to be covering the entire 46 slides from the online version, just because really I can't speak that fast. So I selected some of the key findings to present today. So after an overview slide, I'll be discussing some background, what motivated the study, followed by a quick summary of the methodology before diving into the results and finishing off with some of the key conclusions and policy implications from the work. So in this study, we've simulated demand charge savings from residential solar using a number of demand charge designs. So our analysis includes customers in 15 cities, 9 PV system sizes, 4 panel orientations over a 17-year period. It focuses specifically on residential customers with solar, and we really seek to answer this question, which is to what extent and under what conditions can rooftop solar reduce residential demand charges. So the analysis summarized here is, as Galen mentioned, the first in a series of studies. We'll have some analysis that also focuses on related questions. In particular, we'll be expanding the work to include demand charge savings from solar plus an added storage element. We'll also have a separate study looking at commercial demand charge savings, because of course commercial customers are going to have very different load profiles and characteristics than residential ones. We'll also package these to understand the ways in which the customer demand charge savings from solar will align with utility cost savings from distributed solar. So why have we decided to conduct this analysis? Well, we've been motivated by the increased attention that residential demand charges have received in the last few years. Demand charges, which really traditionally have been more of a common rate design for commercial and industrial customers, they are the component of the customer's utility bill which is not based on how much electricity is consumed over the month, but rather on the peak usage, so on the kilowatts, that maximum load. And these demand charges are usually in dollars per kilowatt. Residential electricity bills for the large majority of customers don't currently have a demand charge component, but they're being actively considered in an increasing number of states, particularly in light of the broader retail rate reform discussions and related to these concerns that have been discussed about solar revenue issues for utilities. When they have been offered, demand charges have been offered more on a voluntary basis for residential customers, but we have seen some states and utilities considering mandatory demand charges for residential customers, either for all customers or specifically for solar customers. So to be clear, this analysis is not meant to advocate one way or another for demand charges, but instead to really kind of understand what customers may expect in terms of bill savings related to demand charges, and to help understand how the customer bill savings may then align with the utility cost savings in the context of cost-reflective rate design. So a bit more background on demand charges. So as I've mentioned, demand charges come in a variety of flavors. So aside from the most basic demand charge, which is really based on a peak demand charge regardless of timing, and which is at the same level in dollars per kilowatt for all months, there are other designs, elements that are available to utilities. So one demand charge design element is seasonal differentiation. So with seasonal differentiation, some months are going to have a higher demand charge level than others. A common seasonal distinction is going to be a summer or non-summer distinction. Another is how often the billing demand is evaluated, as well as ratchets. So though billing demand is usually determined on a monthly basis, it can also be evaluated on an annual basis, though the annual demand charge is not one that we consider in this analysis. Ratchets can also be used. So ratchets are going to set billing demand any given month as a fixed percentage of the maximum demand in the previous year. So this is going to make a customer's annual peak drive the demand charge for most months. Billing demand is usually measured as an average load over a predefined time interval. This is often 15 minutes, 30 minutes to an hour, and sometimes even more. The timing of billing demand measurement is another way demand charges can be designed and differentiated. So as I mentioned, the most common demand charge is going to be based on the customer's demand during the entire billing cycle, but it can also be measured over a predefined peak window. Billing demand can also be defined as customer load at the actual time of the system peak, though we don't consider this coincident peak demand in our analysis. So related to this, the predefined peak window definition can vary to cover a range of hours in the day. And finally, demand charges can be tiered. So demand charges can change with increasing billing demand, though we don't consider this in this current study. Now let's go on to the methodology before we jump into the results. So the analysis is based on 30-minute weather data spanning a 17-year historical period from 1998 to 2014 from the National Solar Radiation Database. Using those data, we then simulate building loads for single-family homes using the Energy Plus building simulation platform and the Energy Plus residential prototype building models. The simulations are performed across 15 U.S. cities, and for multiple home heating types, we list these customer characteristics here on the right. We have different heating types, foundation types, as well as building vintages. We then use the same weather data to simulate rooftop PV generation using NREL's System Advisor model. These simulations are performed for the same set of U.S. cities and across PV system sizes that range from 20% to 100% of each customer's annual energy consumption. And we do so for 4 orientations, south, southwest, west, and flat panels. In the end, this leaves us with 12,960 pairs of building load and PV generation data over the 17-year period. For each pair of load PV data, we're then going to estimate monthly demand charge savings from solar by comparing demand charges with and without solar under a number of demand charge designs that I'm going to be discussing in the following slide. So here are the exact demand charge designs we simulated in this study. So the first is what we call the basic demand charge. This is really simply based on the customer's monthly peak over the 30-minute averaging window. We also consider a seasonal demand charge, where the demand charge levels during the summer months are going to be 3 times higher than for the rest of the year. The ratchet we simulate sets billing demand any given month to 90% of the customer's maximum load in the previous year. Even though in most cases we're considering a 30-minute averaging interval, we also look at averaging windows of 1, 2, and 4 hours. And finally, we consider a large number of peak window definitions. In fact, we've simulated 66 different peak window definitions with varying start and end times from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. So for example, we'd have a 12 noon to 4 p.m. peak demand charge, which would set the billing demand as the monthly maximum demand during those hours. So as with all research studies, I guess, and particularly when we base it on simulations, this study is going to have its limitations, and so I wanted to spend a couple minutes discussing its boundaries. So as I mentioned when introducing the methodology, the load profiles and PV generation profiles are simulated, and though they do reflect weather-related variations, they're not going to reflect all sources of customer load variability. So for example, the simulated load profiles don't reflect variations across customers within a given city in occupancy patterns or even all possible differences in end-use equipment. And this doesn't necessarily indicate a systematic under- or overestimation of average demand charge savings, but it is something to note. We also consider 30-minute averaging intervals and greater, and this is due to the fact that we use 30-minute weather data as the basis of our simulated load and PV generation profiles. But we do recognize that there are some demand charges that are going to be based on shorter time periods. 15-minute average intervals are likely going to yield lower demand charge savings than the ones that we're going to present here. And because our results indicate that demand charge savings increase with the length of the averaging interval, we would think that the 15-minute average interval is going to really yield lower demand charge savings. The analysis doesn't consider storage or demand management, which of course would impact the ability for PV to reduce demand charges. As I mentioned, as Galen mentioned, we're going to be considering storage in a future study. And finally, we consider a fair number of demand charge designs, but we do recognize that there's certainly other ones out there possible. So let's jump into the results. And when presenting the results, we'll be using 2 demand charge saving metrics. The first is the percentage reduction in billing demand, which is billing demand reduction over billing demand without PV. And this is really used to provide a point of comparison to bill savings that can be achieved through volumetric rates. So under the demand charge design we've called the basic demand charge, solar isn't particularly effective at reducing the demand charges. The figure here shows the distribution of billing demand reduction under this basic design, where the median billing demand is about 3%, and we see that 95% of the cases have a demand charge savings less than 8%. The chart here is based on all 12,960 combinations of load and PV simulation profiles over all months of the 17-year period considered. The main reason for which demand charge reductions are relatively small in this case is that customer loads tend to peak in the evening time. So in this graphical example here, which shows a hypothetical customer's load without PV in blue and the customer's net load with PV in red, we see that the customer peaks around 5 p.m. in this case without PV, and the peak shifts to about 6 p.m. when we consider PV into the line. So solar only has a limited potential to reduce billing demand and hence demand charges. In fact, billing demand reduction is going to be limited by the customer's maximum monthly demand level in the evening time when solar is not generated. So that said, demand charge savings can be more significant when we consider other demand charge designs. So this figure here shows the range in percentage billing demand reduction for some of the demand charge designs we've considered. So the X in the box is the mean value. The shaded box is the 25th to 75th percentile range, and the whiskers leave out the outliers. So the first thing that kind of jumps out here is that if we restrict billing demand to be defined during the 12 to 4 p.m. period, we can have a much more significant demand charge savings, as we see on the bar far to the right here. The median reduction in this case is 34%. Another item of note is that adding a seasonal element, a ratchet, or even increasing the average in time interval to 2 hours really doesn't impact the demand charge savings in a significant way. Though we'll be discussing the peak period definitions a bit more today, I'll leave you all to look at the online slide deck for a deeper dive into those other demand charge designs, particularly the seasonal and the ratchet demand charge designs. The box and whisker plot from the previous slide included simulations over all PV system sizes considered. But if we break out the results by PV system size, as we do in this slide here, we see that demand charge reductions increase with PV system size, though with diminishing returns. So the figure here shows the demand charge reductions for the basic demand charge in red and one with a 12 to 4 p.m. peak window definition in blue. The solid lines here are the median values, and the shadings represent the 5th to 95th percentile range of our results. So what we can see is that PV systems that are going to be sized to meet 20% of annual usage reduce demand charges by a median of 2% for the basic demand charge and 20% in the case with the 12 to 4 p.m. peak demand charge design. But increases in system size don't yield a proportionally greater demand charge savings. So the diminishing returns we see here are because demand charges in some months can easily be reduced with relatively small PV systems. When you increase the PV system size, peak demand is going to be more likely to be set on a cloudy day or in the evening time. This is in contrast to volumetric rates, which tend to scale with PV system size. In most cases with net metering, as long as the customer's annual generation is going to be less than her total load, PV is going to be compensated at roughly the same rate. So the second metric we consider in this analysis is what we call demand charge capacity credit. So the demand charge capacity credit is calculated by dividing the billing demand reduction by the PV system size. So for example, a 10 kilowatt PV system which reduces the billing demand by 4 kilowatts would have a demand charge capacity credit of 4 over 10, so 40%. So this metric really provides a point of comparison to bulk power capacity credit, the capacity of generation that can be avoided per kilowatt of PV. But we shouldn't confuse those two terms. We present these results to be able to directly compare the demand charge savings from PV systems of different sizes. So by dividing by PV system size, that allows us to kind of understand how effective systems of different sizes are at reducing the demand charge. The rest of the results I'll be presenting today are presented in terms of this metric. What you'll see is that the magnitude of the demand charge credit is generally smaller than the percentage reduction in billing demand, but the trends tend to be similar. So the figure here is similar to that of the earlier slide we saw, but hopefully the repetition ends there, yeah, at least for the rest of the presentation. But what we see here is that it shows the distribution of demand charge capacity credits rather than the demand charge reductions. The results look similar to those for the percentage demand charge reductions, but the values are all lower. Most of the range we observe in this figure is due to the range in PV system sizes. But contrary to the percentage reduction in billing demand, smaller PV systems lead to the largest demand charge capacity credits. And we'll be exploring that a bit more in a future slide. We see that the capacity credits are larger when we use the peak period definition. And how we define the peak period is clearly important in determining the level of the capacity credit. And we'll be looking in a little bit more depth on that also. So something we should note here is that the figure is based on average of the monthly values over that 17-year period for each demand charge design. There's also a month-to-month variability. We do quantify, but I won't be talking about explicitly today, but we can find in the online slide deck. So as we saw in the previous slide, how peak periods are defined have a significant impact on the magnitude of the demand charge capacity credit. So on this slide, we look a bit deeper into peak period definitions. The figure here shows the range in capacity credits over a number of peak period definitions, which we have organized by ending hour. Residential loads tend to have higher consumption levels in the mornings and early evenings than the midday, and the daily peaks usually in the evening. So demand charges are typically set by the level of demand in the end of the peak period window. So for example, if we have the 12 to 6 p.m. peak window, we usually see a peak load at 6 p.m. And because solar is less effective at reducing load in those later hours, peak period windows that end later will tend to have a lower demand charge capacity credit, whereas the start times have really less of an impact on the capacity credit levels. Another driver of variability in demand charge that we haven't yet looked at is location. The location can drive demand charge savings due to both customer load profile and PV generation profile. So the figure here shows the distribution in demand charge capacity credit over 4 selected cities for the basic demand charge on the left side of the figure, and the 12 to 4 p.m. peak period definition on the right. So clearly there are much greater differences across cities for the peak period demand charge than the basic demand charge. So the differences in capacity credit levels we see are driven by two key factors. So the first is the peakiness of load shapes. Higher loads during peak demand windows allow for a deeper demand charge savings. And the next is cloudiness levels. In cities with a high number of cloudy days, billing demand is more likely to be set on a cloudy day. And hence, this is going to lower the average capacity credit level as solar, of course, isn't able to reduce billing demand on cloudy days. The range we see within any given city is a result of the PV system sizes that we consider. So we did look to try and understand more closely at the weather patterns and their effect on demand charge savings. And we found that the savings often depend on how sunny the location is on average and how variable the cloudiness is. So customers in sunny locations generally have higher peak demands, often driven by air conditioning. And this, therefore, there's more peak demand to potentially reduce. Customer load profiles in sunny locations tend to coincide better with the timing of PV generation. And both these factors can be explained, again, by air conditioning load in many cases, when and where PV resources are the best. As for cloudiness, locations with intermittent cloudiness are going to have greater month-to-month variability in demand charge savings, as there are going to be some months where the customer peak load occurs during times of passing clouds. So next I have this hypothetical example. So this graphical example to help us understand some of these underlying dynamics with cloudiness. So we have this hypothetical customer without, so the blue line is their load without PV, and the red line is the net load with PV. And as we can see, there are 3 cloud events here, resulting in a higher net load level during those events. If we consider a 12 to 4 p.m. peak window, billing demand would be set at point B without PV. With PV, billing demand would be set earlier in the day, and in this case during a cloud event at point C. Although the customer is able to reduce their billing demand, the reduction in billing demand is really limited by the cloudiest hour within the peak period window. The hour C here reduced PV generations and sets billing demand. So now let's turn to system size. So we noted earlier that there's a diminishing returns, and this slide kind of highlights the diminishing returns to billing demand reductions as PV system sizes increase. So the figure here on this slide shows how the demand charge capacity credit decreases with increasing PV system size. The shaded area is the range, and the 2 lines show the median capacity credit levels for Phoenix in blue on the top and Seattle in red on the bottom. And the decline in demand charge capacity credit implies that each additional kilowatt in PV system size becomes progressively less effective for the customer at reducing billing demand. Under the basic demand charge design on the left, no further reductions in billing demand can occur once the net customer peak is already pushed into the evening time. With the peak period demand charge design, demand charge in some months can be completely eliminated with relatively small PV systems. So larger PV systems can't reduce billing demand any further since it's already 0 for those months. And the ranges that are shown here are really mostly due to differences in location. So now let's do a deeper dive into the length of the averaging window. The figure here shows the range in demand charge capacity credit for varying window lengths, ranging from 30 minutes, which is our base case, to 4 hours, for both the basic demand charge and a 12 to 4 p.m. peak period demand charge design. So we clearly see that the demand charge savings are greater with longer averaging intervals, and these differences are going to be accentuated with daytime peak period definitions. So what's going on here is that the longer averaging intervals dampen the effect of cloud events and also tend to capture PV generation during earlier times of the day when PV generation is higher. So under the basic demand charge, the effect is relatively minor, though it's most obvious in the 4-hour averaging window, which captures solar generation from the 4 hours preceding the peak load when PV is generating. Under the peak period demand charge, the length of the averaging window has much more of a pronounced effect. For example, so we see the 4-hour interval captures the impact of PV generation on average load over the entire 12 to 4 p.m. period rather than just the last 30 minutes of that period. If we further differentiate the impact of the averaging interval by location, we see that its effect is most significant for regions with intermittent clouds. So the figure here shows how the median demand charge capacity credit changes with increasing interval window length for 3 cities: Phoenix, the top one in orange, Miami in blue, and Seattle, the green one at the bottom. So we do see an increase in capacity credit for all cities as you increase averaging interval window, but it increases more for Miami than for Seattle, for example. So this is partially going to be the result of intermittency of Miami's cloud cover. When cloud cover is intermittent, clouds can have a significant effect in dampening the demand charge savings when smaller averaging windows are going to be used. But as you increase the averaging window, there can be significant benefits from the smoothing effects we see over the several hours. So we've heard a fair bit of discussion about the impact of panel orientation on electricity bill savings from solar. It's often touted, southwest and west facing. We know peak later in the day when compared to south facing. So here we're going to try and understand how panel orientation impacts demand charge savings. And what we find is that the impacts are modest and that they're going to depend both on demand charge design as well as system size. There's a lot going on in the figure here, so I'm going to spend a minute explaining about explaining what we're looking at. So the y-axis is the demand charge capacity credit, and the x-axis is orientation for several demand charge designs for Phoenix, which is on the left side, and Seattle on the right side of the figure. And so, for example, if we focus on the 2 lines furthest to the left, these represent capacity credit levels for the basic demand charge for a small PV system in blue and a larger PV system in red. The 3 points in each of the lines are the 3 orientations we consider, moving from left to right, from south to southwest, and to west. The left panel here is again for Phoenix, and the right is Seattle. One element that we observe is that for small systems, so the blue lines, southwest and west-facing panels tend to lead to a higher capacity credit than south-facing. For large systems, there's less benefit from the southwest and west-facing panels. And in part, this is because demand charges in some months are already eliminated with the south-facing systems. And so there are no further gains from optimizing orientation. Another consideration here is that south-facing panels have the highest total PV generation in terms of kilowatt hours per kilowatt. So other orientations are going to require larger systems to maintain the same PV to load ratio. And of course, mathematically, given that we use system size in the calculation of the demand charge capacity credit, this is going to tend to reduce the demand charge, a capacity credit for the non-south orientation. So again, let's take a little bit of a closer look with a graphical example. So here we have our hypothetical customer, this time with two PV systems orientations. The net load with south-facing panels is in orange, and west-facing panels in red. So under a basic demand charge, the building demand with PV doesn't change with orientation, as peak demand is pushed into the evening time for both orientations. As one would expect, with an afternoon peak window, west-facing panels are going to lead to more demand reduction than south-facing, a result from the fact that the peak PV generation is later for west-facing panels than it is for south. However, as I had mentioned just now, west-facing panels generate fewer kilowatt hours per kilowatt, and so require larger nameplate capacity to reach the same PV to load ratio, and this is partially going to offset the greater billing demand reduction when calculating the capacity credit. So let's take an example here on this table on the bottom right. The west-facing panel reduces billing demand, for example, by 25% more than the south-facing panel. But because the system size needs to be larger, this only results in a 10% increase in capacity credit. For even larger PV to load ratios, when billing demand is zeroed out completely, and therefore billing demand reduction is going to be the same for both orientations, the capacity credit is actually going to be larger for the south-facing systems. Because, again, PV system size for the south-facing system is going to be smaller than the west-facing system in the way we've defined PV to load ratio. So with that, let's discuss some of the major conclusions from the study as well as policy implications. So first, we're going to note kind of our most basic conclusions. So solar isn't particularly effective at reducing residential demand charges when billing demand, which is used to calculate the demand charge, is set by the customer's monthly peak load, so under our basic case. That said, some demand charges and some demand charge designs are more solar friendly, as they allow solar to reduce billing demand more effectively than the basic demand charge design. And notably, the daytime peak demand charge is going to allow a higher demand level to be reduced by solar. When we look into the range of capacity credit levels for any given demand charge design, we find that most of the variability in demand charge reduction is a result of differences in PV system sizes, for one, as well as customer location. Now, relating to PV system sizes, we found that each incremental kilowatt of PV installed becomes less effective at reducing demand charges for the customer for most demand charge designs we considered. For orientation, southwest and west-facing PV systems generally have capacity credits that are higher than the south-facing systems for those demand charge designs with afternoon peak windows, and for smaller PV systems. Another conclusion from this work is that demand charge savings are clearly higher in sunnier locations. There's been some discussion of longer time averaging windows for demand charges, and we found that longer time averaging windows are going to lead to higher capacity credit levels. The next couple of conclusions here we didn't discuss in great detail today, but are covered in the greater depth slide deck online. The first is that seasonal demand charges, where again particular months have a higher demand charge than others, can increase average capacity credits if capacity credit levels are higher in those higher price month, but that effect tends to be relatively small. Next, when we add a ratchet, that tends to decrease the demand charge savings, given that the maximum demand that sets the ratchet in a given year is often going to be set on a cloudy month, and that limits the ability for PV to reduce demand charges in other months. And finally, again, there's a slide dedicated to this in the online slide deck. The month-to-month variability in demand charge savings can be significant. So we've also kind of translated some of these conclusions into policy implications. The first is that moving away from a fully volumetric electricity rate to a demand charge, in addition to a lower volumetric rate, will generally reduce bill savings from residential solar with net metering. So even in the most solar-friendly demand charge designs, solar is going to reduce the demand charge only partially. There are ways in which solar may mitigate the erosion of bill savings, though. One, for example, would be through load management or storage. And again, we haven't considered that in the current study, but we will be looking at that explicitly in a future study in the series. Perhaps maybe not quite intuitively, orienting PV panels to the southwest or west really only has limited value in mitigating reduced bill savings. And because of the diminishing returns on system size, demand charges are likely to encourage smaller PV systems, which would lead to higher bill savings on a per kilowatt basis. So we haven't directly compared customer demand charge savings with utility cost savings from distributed solar, but our findings would indicate that in some cases, demand charges may undercompensate solar customers for savings to the electric system, whereas other cases, the opposite would be the case. In a number of situations, demand charge capacity credit is close to zero, and that's not necessarily a realistic reflection of the solar capacity value across the entirety of the electric system when we consider generation, transmission, distribution. And also another observation is that there isn't much economic rationale for providing lower demand charge savings per kilowatt to larger systems, which is effectively the case due to this diminishing returns on size, which we've described and found. I haven't presented results on the month-to-month variability in the demand charge savings today, but we did find that there can be significant monthly variations in demand charge savings, and this would have an effect on how dependable demand charge savings are any given month. This could potentially have implications on customers who are more sensitive to swings in electricity bills, perhaps lower income customers or fragile populations, as well as possible financiers who are looking for a constant income from solar. And finally, there are going to be some demand charge designs that lead to larger bill savings from solar than others, and particularly the ones with the peak window definitions in the afternoon, as well as the ones with longer averaging intervals. So with that, I'd like to thank you for being here today and to listening in on this webinar. I'd like to thank our Department of Energy program liaisons for the support in their work, as well as the members here of the advisory group, as well as people who have provided input on our earlier version of this presentation. If you'd like to get in touch with us, our phone number, Gail and my phone number are here, as well as our email addresses. The publication you can download from this website here, as well as all of our other publications, and if you're interested in joining our mailing list. Galen, let's, I guess, start the Q&A session for the next 13 minutes or so.
Sure, yeah, and just before beginning that, let me just reiterate that we will be posting a recording of this webinar shortly. It'll be located at the same web address shown on the slide here. So if you go to that web address, you can find the recording. Of course, we have a longer slide deck that's already posted. So everything that Naeem just walked through is basically contained within a larger slide deck that's already available, so you can access that now if you'd like. So let's see, we have a couple questions here, not many. I think the first one, and this is maybe sort of a comment perhaps more than a question, at least as far as it pertains to our work, but it asks whether it would make sense to have demand charges for different functions, for different utility functions. For example, having a demand charge for generation and transmission costs that might be based on the customer contribution to system peak, and then maybe a separate demand charge based on customers' non-coincident demand to recover their transformer costs, and then perhaps a separate demand charge yet again for distribution system costs. And of course, this work here is not really intended to inform demand charge design overall. There are many other considerations involved beyond just those that affect solar customers. But I think what the work here certainly shows is that if utilities were to move in that direction and kind of have demand charges that sort of had various components that were each more or less aligned to sort of cost causation associated with each different function, then that would certainly make things more complicated for solar customers. But to the extent that at least one or more of those demand charge elements was based on sort of a mid-afternoon daytime peak period, that at least that portion of the overall demand charge would be potentially kind of reducible by solar customers. Let's see, and I just encourage folks to keep submitting questions if you like. So we've got another one here. So Naeem, you talked just sort of in passing at the very end about variability, sort of month-to-month variability in demand charge savings. Can you talk at all about sort of how the variability, that month-to-month variability, differed between different kinds of demand charge designs? In other words, are those sort of month-to-month demand charge savings more predictable under certain kinds of demand charge designs than others?
Yeah, so unfortunately I don't have that slide up, but if you do go to slide 37 of the version online, there are, so basically the peak window demand charges tend to have a smaller variability, a month-to-month variability, and the basic as well as the ratchet will have the greatest one. In fact, the ratchet by far has the greatest one because it really depends on one month to the next on whether the ratchet is going to be set on a cloudy day or not. So the ratchet is probably the demand charge design that has is most prone to variability, whereas the smaller the peak window and the smaller the lower the variability we're going to see.
Okay, great. So we've got one other question here that relates to demand charges compared to fixed monthly customer charges. Can you talk at all about how, for a solar customer, what the difference is between a demand charge and a fixed monthly customer charge?
Sure. So a fixed customer charge. So a few ways to answer this question. So just for definition's sake, the fixed customer charge is going to be often a monthly charge that solar cannot reduce at all. So it's kind of a mandatory charge that all customers will have to pay, and solar can't displace it at all. As we saw, depending on how the demand charge is designed, and where you're located, you may be able to displace some of the demand charge. And so already there, one of the kind of main differences is that at least some of the demand charge can be reduced by the solar system. If you also add storage to that, then you can even more effectively perhaps reduce the demand charge. Whereas storage, again, combined with solar, can't impact the customer's fixed charge. The second kind of way to answer is it really kind of depends on how large the fixed customer charge is and how large the demand charge is for any given customer. In some cases, we could have a demand charge equal to half the customer bill. That is less likely to be the case with a fixed customer charge, a fixed monthly customer charge. So just the magnitude on its own is going to impact the solar customer in different ways.
Okay, great. And sort of maybe a follow-up to that question, perhaps. Can you say anything about, and this question actually, I'll just say, kind of goes beyond the scope of our current work and begins to bleed into what some of the kind of next phases of this analysis will get at. But the question is essentially kind of what, how well demand charge savings from solar customers line up with the utility fixed costs. In other words, at least as far as solar customers are concerned, are demand charges an effective way of utilities recovering their fixed costs?
So indeed it is beyond the scope, but it is something that we'll be looking at in more detail. So stay tuned for a more in-depth analysis. But again, a few ways to answer this. It depends what the demand charge is designed to recover. So how well it lines up with how well the demand charge lines up with the fixed costs is going to be different if we're trying to recover distribution fixed costs, which are going to tend in residential circuits at least to peak in the evening time, or if we're looking at kind of system-wide costs, which include generation costs, and system-wide peaks tend to be earlier in the afternoon. And so depending on what fixed costs you're looking to recover through your demand charge, the way you design your demand charge is going to kind of tell us how well aligned it is with whichever fixed cost. So for example, a 12 to 4 p.m. Peak window definition for a demand charge may be appropriate if you're looking to recover fixed costs related to your system-wide peak, because system-wide peak generation is around, depending on where you are, could be in that time window. And so that could be an effective way, and therefore the reduction in demand charge with that kind of demand charge design is going to be pretty good reflection. So the reduction due to solar may be a pretty good reflection of the actual cost reduction. However, if you're looking to recover a distribution fixed cost, which let's say will peak in the evening time, if you have a 12 to 4 p.m. peak window, that's not good. Misaligned in this case. because you're allowing the solar to reduce that demand charge. However, there's no kind of equivalent reduction in cost for distribution if the distribution tends to be in these weekends.
All right, great. Well, thanks, Naeem. I think that pretty much takes us to the end of the hour here. And I think before we part, I'll just like to thank everybody again, of course, for joining us. If folks have additional questions that pop into your minds after we end the call, please do feel free to reach out to either Naeem or myself. And then lastly, I'll just reiterate that we do have a number of other related studies that will be coming out over the course of the next few months. The next one, I believe, will probably be similar to what you saw today, but will focus instead on commercial customers with solar. And so the results there should be interesting and will be, I think, different in some useful ways, given just the differences in load profiles of commercial customers. So keep your eyes out for that work. And again, thanks very much for joining us. All right.